I am, by all means, a simple backwoods bumpkin. I raise cattle to sell, sometimes. I drive a beater pickup, and I live in my grandpa's old shotgun home he built in the 40s. He carved a sizable farm out of the forest here, used damn near all the lumber he cut to make the house, the barn, the sheds, the posts for pasture, so on and so forth. He died roughly 4 years ago, and I've been managing the land ever since. My father was utterly absent from the picture, so I not only inherited the farm, but my grandpa's entire personality and routines too. That means I get up a little before sunrise and make me a cup of black coffee with a spoonful or two of brown sugar 'cause it's good, and watch the equivalent of the morning news while I whip up some bacon and eggs, which for me, as a more modern individual within my estranged family, is YouTube and a touch of Facebook. Afterwards, I go out, feed and tend to the cows, and then tuck into whatever means of work I have for the month. I'm a McClooney man, Jake McClooney. In this county, that name holds some weight. McClooney folks are known to just know things. My grandpa knew what to turn, take off, tighten, replace, move, adjust, or cut in anything he was doing. There was once a man who couldn't figure out why his engine was knocking, which is a common thing to have an issue with on older trucks used in farming. My grandpa goes out, spends half a day tinkering under the hood, and the truck may as well have been brand new, the way it ran after. Engine knock was gone, air conditioner blew colder, got better gas mileage. Didn't say what he did, just took the wad of money the man offered him and wished him well. He just knew things. I have the same gift, and it's been how I keep myself in this farm living a life of few struggles. That, and I also rent out my farm equipment to the others around here. I haven't got any good cows to sell just yet. 2 or 3 heifers and calves. The other, I fear, may be infertile, and the bull may as well be family at this point. Recently, my business endeavors have introduced me to the world of antiques and amateur archaeology. I realize this is all a lot of information that doesn't explain the title, but bear with me. The month of October had been marked with colder nights than were common. A lot of folks weren't ready, and the sold-out jacket and hand warmer section at Walmart told enough. A snow watch on the news laid waste to the bread and milk sections, even though all it did was piss cold rain. There had been an uneasy feeling around the farm later in the nights when I stayed up. I felt more like a kid scared out of his wits and paranoid after a horror movie. Looking out into the dark fields and the tall oaks at night unsettled me for some reason. Whatever I was looking for was always moving in a blink, dashing into the peripheral and blind spots when my eyes seemed to form a shape. I began to suspect there was a bear or a cougar prowling around. Maybe a large pack of coyotes, but damn if they didn't move strange. I took to looking over my shoulder more, listening hard when I walked through the woods after a day of deer hunting, trying hard to beat the sun before it set. My fears came unannounced, but expected eventually. It all started on a crisp October morning, Halloween funnily enough. For one, my coffee machine broke, and I tried to boil myself a cup of Folgers, which tasted awful. Afterwards, my cigarette went out because I ashed it too hard while I was walking to the hay baler machine I had agreed to look at. And the first turn of a wrench, my hand slipped and I put 4 knuckles into the baler frame. Now normally you get a plow or spreader looked at before you do a hay baler since this is planting season for hay, but this man had money and had his idea figured up in his head, so I hushed and accepted the job. He didn't explain to me what was wrong, but he explained the noises it made when it ran and how it seemed to act when he used it. Listening to him, my mind went to work. Hydraulic lines, roller bearings, both tension springs. I set into the baler much like the old-timer did, slow yet deliberate. I worked in the pale morning light and into the afternoon bask. Took an hour for lunch, came back and worked until the evening sun painted the sky orange and pink hues. I had the lines off and started on the tension springs, intending to tackle the bearings tomorrow morning, but the sun beat me to it. Not to mention how tedious both untightening and replacing the hydraulic lines was for no good reason. Tiredly getting out of my work spot within the open baler frame, I set about cleaning up and putting my tools away as it got dark. Normally, I go back into the house, clean up for dinner, and call it even for the night, but the sudden roar and cracks of splintering beams changed that quickly. In my mind, it sounded like Charlie. My bull was fighting with a cow. Or maybe he'd gotten stuck and was freaking out. Bad situation in any amount. Either way, I ran into the house and grabbed up Grandpa's rifle, a worn Remington 7.42 that rested above my door in a deer hoof gun rack. Yes, it is exactly what it sounds like. Even if I loved that bull like a pet, it was still a half-ton hunk of pissed and freaked out and prone to do anything. The 7.42 was the one exception to the family rule. Keep your guns unloaded and put up. It had a 10-round magazine, but he'd manually loaded an extra 11th into the chamber, so I did the same. Needless to say, all I did was grab that gun, flip the breaker switch to my barn lights, and tore off across the road to see just what the hell was happening. Sliding under the barbed wire fence like so many times before, I flipped the safety off my rifle as I moved towards the source of the noise and prepared for the worst. The barn had one set of loft doors in the front and a side opening on the left that the cows could pass through to bed down in the back during especially hard winters. Where I entered under the fence, it made the left side of the barn the closest to myself, and I quickly covered ground across the little bit of open field between them. Cautiously easing into the barn, I looked to the back where the cows stood wide-eyed, agitated, protecting the calves pacing around behind them and making spooked squeals. Blood, fur, and shattered cedar wood beams let me know whatever got the bull to freak out had done it inside, as it was evident Charlie, the two-horned behemoth, had shown whatever had tried his herd that he wouldn't go down without a fight. Black ooze replaced more and more of red blood towards what were once tin loft doors that now stood peeled open like tuna can lids. And outside I found Charlie, just a little ways from the barn. The bull stood and pawed the ground under him, turning over something large that flapped with the noise a rustling tarp makes. I raised my gun, took a step back, getting a little closer to the barn in the event I needed to run for cover. I cleared my throat and whistled. Charlie whipped his massive head around, blood dripping off his snout, black ooze coating his right horn and front hooves, and I could see then something had slashed the middle of his face. 3 long cuts from the flat of his skull down into his nose, laying the meat open. I've never seen an animal look as fearful as I did this bull, like you could read it in his big brown eyes that he was mortified. With a low groan, Charlie trotted towards me, with his head held by his feet, like a chastised dog does when you holler at it for stealing something. The closer he got, the more and more I could see cuts and gashes on his body. It was like a giant claw machine had tried to pick him up with razor blades, each time leaving long, thin wounds on his back and neck. Charlie looked miserable, but none of what he'd taken was going to be lethal to him. Cattle are some resilient creatures, but he'd need some damn serious veterinarian care in the morning. I considered patting him or saying something to comfort him, but something in my head spoke up, that McClooney intuition. Back up into the barn, now. In situations like this, where your inner voice or gut tells you to do something, 9 times out of 10, you need to listen carefully and hop too. So I did. Charlie had taken up a spot at the front of the cows and laid down in exhaustion, steam rolling off his wounds, tiredly sucking in and blowing out deep draws of air. I made my way past them and shut the doors on the left before taking up a spot a few feet back from the front. The cows weren't going to run past me. Charlie wasn't in the mood to rush me, so whatever was going to happen, it would come to me first. Aim just a little higher than you would for a man. I adjusted my aim by a foot, unsure of what I was going to shoot that stood that tall. I got my answer soon after. A series of groaning wood beams and scrapes of claws against the sheet tin roof let me know that it was moving along the peak of the barn. Suddenly, a loud thud smacked against the ground, just out of sight and off to the side, screeches of pain and annoyance following it. It had been on the roof above me and Charlie the whole time, watching us. That's why he went inside in such a scared manner. I could hear labored wheezing and steps that sounded ill-placed and uncoordinated. Something large and hurt was limping towards us. My heart started racing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood, and I knew whatever it was outside was unnatural to this world. When it turned the corner into the overhead barn lights, I nearly pissed myself. It stood a full 2 feet over me. If not for the shrunken stomach and visible ribs under tightly stretched skin, I would have reckoned it weighed more than me at some point, too. 2 scorching red orbs peered around aimlessly. Black stained lips peeled back to expose needle-like teeth, and a shattered mess of flat nose flared to snort out clots of dark filth at my feet. What stood in the doorway was, by all definitions, a giant bat. A tall, battered, angry, bipedal bat. It seemed to focus a little more intently after it cleared its nose. It had caught scent of the cows and I. It took a singular labored step towards us before it let off a series of clicks. This time it snapped its head directly at me. A sick sense of dread slammed into my stomach. I didn't need an explanation for why it suddenly opened up its spindly arms and flared out long, dagger-like talons, nor why it took another ragged step. There was a good 10 feet between me and this monster. If it rushed me now, it would be on me in an instant, and everything about this thing screamed death. Intuition came back to my thoughts, snapping me out of a mixture of terror and wonderment. Put your iron sights just under the left eye. It wasn't moving fast at all, so lining up the shot was easy. It was the adrenaline and the fear that made it hard not to shake and tremble. Rather than intuition, I heard the wisdom of my grandpa come through from my memories, his burlap voice just as clear as day. You gonna be mighty excited when you see your first buck. Barely gonna remember to breathe and aim right. But take a second to calm yourself before you squeeze that trigger. No excuse for wounding an animal 'cause your nerves are scattered. Get it right the first time. Won't have to fix it afterwards. One deep breath, a little widening of my foot placement, a little more lean into the rifle. It took another step and reared back its right hand, just within reach of me. It stopped and cocked its head when I exhaled, as if curious that the thing before it wasn't trying to run. That was all I needed. The first shot went right where I wanted it, perfectly under the left eye. The deafening claim of the 30-06 rattled the walls and shook the cold air. Behind the creature, the wall was suddenly painted with black gore. Fragments of white and gray matter peppered the knotted cedar wood planks. The eye above the bullet hole started spasming, the socket collapsing and oozing out sickly orange-reddish fluid. At close range, or point blank as it was here, 30-06 acts much like a steel brick traveling at fuck you speed. 30-06 was developed for warfare, and it comes loaded at many varying grains. For whatever reason, my grandpa liked it at 220, which for most game here is a touch overkill. In this case, it was just right enough to punch a hole clean through this thing's face, big enough to see the light on the other side. Something spoke up again. Another one. Charlie broke its nose. Take it out completely. I followed suit. The wall was given a second coating. Its face seemed to cave in this time, slumping left into the first bullet wound and then forward. A sickly gurgle came forth. A pool of black slime rushed out of its mouth and spilled down its chin and chest and onto the floor around its feet in thick streams. It may rush you now out of desperation. Put one in the hip. I lowered the gun and shot again. It made some attempt to raise its arms out in front of it, as if it were trying to protect itself from the bullet. What it got for that effort was eviscerated hands. The bullet still went through, and the loud crack that followed my shot told me that it had hit where it needed to. I think the military calls this a failure to stop drill. I took a quick leap back as it tripped forward and slammed down onto both knees, heaving out extremely ragged breaths and sludge. When it landed, I saw what once was likely a wing, now bent into a shattered form and marked by hooves. A bloody stump told of where the other wing used to sit, what Charlie was pawing at when I found him. The bull had been smart, or just plain lucky, to cripple this thing in such a way. A second gurgling came with a flood of black liquid, the murky substance nearly splashing my work boots. Before I tell you my story any further, a word, please. Looking back on it now, This all sounds sadistic or insane, even if it was a monstrous bat, and I guarantee you in some shape or form went, "What the actual fuck?" I do not blame such a reaction towards my description of my first encounter, nor how I handled it, but if you saw what those things are capable of, what cruelty, what savagery, you'll find what I did was equivalent to picking daisies and blowing bubbles. You haven't heard what happened to the Harvey family yet. If it would have managed to get a singular claw on me, it would have strung my guts across the rafters and dashed my body against whatever struck its fancy until I turned into nothing more than gore and debris. In the years since that night, I've learned plenty about these freaks of nature, many a lesson learned the hard way too. It is better to lay your sense of morality and mercy down when faced with an entity that either cannot comprehend those concepts or is fully capable in choosing to waive any regard for such things. Carrying on. I won't lie and say I handled it like a badass, even if it sounds like it. It was muscle memory and was just what made sense to do. When you're raised shooting guns and hunting, it takes away the shock of shooting your prey to a degree, be it a deer or coyote or giant bat. It also instills a cyclic response to a situation where an animal you've shot is dangerous and coming for you. You don't stop until it stops. This was somewhat the same, but still shook me down to my core. The second the smoke and smell of gunpowder left my nose, it was replaced with the stench of sulfur. The black ooze bubbled out of that thing like molten sugar in a pot that had gotten far too hot too quickly. The bat kept still on the floor, its head looking more like a busted pumpkin left out in the sun to rot than it did the animal it once resembled. It sat awkwardly, likely trying to keep weight off of where the bullet hit it in the hip. I turned and puked on the spot. The combination of adrenaline, sight, and smell of what I had just done was too much too soon. I felt a touch of shame, even if it had been intent on hurting me and the cows. Charlie, however, did not share the same convictions. I turned after my moment of sickness to see a wall of brown muscle tearing past me towards the creature, grunting heavily as he built up speed. In one low sideswipe, Charlie hooked a horn into its chest with a deep thud and jerked up to gore it clean through on his way to the field, its pained, wheezing screeches barely audible under Charlie's thunderous galloping. I scrambled to the bent loft doors to see Charlie in full fury and might, the deep bellows he let loose booming across the pasture and into the trees. He threw his head in a wide circle, slinging the bat off and into the dirt. It looked like it was attempting to crawl away when Charlie pierced it down under his horns. When it stopped moving, he reared up on two hind legs and brought his weight down onto its back repeatedly, like driving fence posts, the creature sputtering as its bones splintered under the bull's weight. I was in no rush to try to calm Charlie down, nor do I think I would have been able to. Animals act on instinct, and his, at this moment, was to ensure this monstrosity couldn't hurt him or his herd ever again. Most I would wind up doing is drawing the same wrath. My knees buckled then, and I had to prop the stock on the ground to steady myself. In one day my entire world got flipped on its head and spun into what I wished was a nightmare. Questions came rapid fire, each one more and more confusing and worrying. What the fuck is that thing? Was it waiting to come down off the roof, or was it falling in an attempt to catch me before I got inside? Are there more? Do these things travel in packs? Is that black stuff toxic or poisonous? Is that what it has for blood? Why does it smell of sulfur? How long has this thing been hunting the cows? Was it ever hunting me? What? When? Where? Why? I lost track of time, just went silent and watched Charlie do his work. I didn't have the ability to move just yet. I didn't know exactly how long I sat there between the loft doors, but it was long enough for Charlie to tear the bat in two, and long enough for the rest of the herd to come and sit closely behind me, the calves licking my hair once in a while, guessed to see if I was dead too. It got painfully cold after a while. All the emotion left my body. Charlie came and sat in front of me, tending to his wounds and falling asleep when he was satisfied with his progress. It amazed me how he went from this mountain of rage to content and peace. Guess he knew he'd killed it for sure. Eventually the sun came up. The first rays came over the tree line and hit the front of the barn, a gentle warmth stirring me back to coherency. I had gotten some sort of sleep, but the cold had settled into my bones and I ached and hurt as I struggled to get to my feet on jelly legs. I crossed the field to where the bigger pieces of that monster lay in temporary shade. None of it looked like anything more than a mass of flesh and burnt motor oil, but God, that stench of sulfur lingered around it. I was almost ready to try and pick up a piece of what I thought was an ear when the sun shined on the remains. Whoosh! Flames, hot and intense, in a flash. I fell over in pain. My eyes felt hot and stuffy. I figured myself blind. I could feel the fire through the soles of my boots. It burned like cedar wood does when it's thick with sap, wild and greedily. I still saw flashes as I looked around, but I could make out enough to know that every piece of the bat that the sun had touched was alight and scattering his ash. I saw Charlie rutting his head into the dirt, a plume of smoke billowing off his horns, legs, and neck. He'd been lucky or just plain smart a second time, and got it covered before the sun hit him. I got concerned for a moment the barn was soon to follow suit, and so I scrambled to my feet and took off. Rushing inside ready to fight a fire, I found all the gore from the bat still there, and still just as putrid. The smell caught in my lungs and stung, nearly making me vomit again. My ears perked up at a funny sound, and upon a more focused gander, the black mess was sizzling quietly, steam rolling off it in lazy waves. It was there I learned that regardless of the amount of sunlight, the bat and its blood would become volatile, meaning that unless it was dark, whatever this thing was couldn't tolerate any level of sunlight. I stood there, staring at the splatter that stained my barn walls, looked over the broken support beams, the torn open loft doors, red and black blood thrown in impossible places. The last few pieces of burning bat and the pool of fluids where the bat had fallen to its knees. Charlie in the doorway, all cut up and dirty, just stood and observed everything in involuntary silence. You get what I mean? Sometimes you can't do much else except look. You can't understand your situation yet. Your brain is burned out, and it's all sensory overload. You chew on your bottom lip and scan it all, trying hard to register something, but ultimately just can't. Charlie let out a low moan, as soft of a moo as a bull that size could muster. It was the same one he makes when he knows it's eating time, and in response, the other cows mooed and started towards the feed troughs behind the barn. Guess you ought to feed the cows, hoss. I searched for the barrel that kept the cattle feed, found it, turned it over where I assumed Charlie threw the bat through the area it was in. Thankfully, the lid was one of them handle-sealed ones. I struggled for a moment, my legs still wobbly, but eventually had it fixed upright. I grabbed a 5-gallon bucket, scooped out a good portion. The bucket felt heavier this time, like how it did when I was a kid and trying to carry it on my own. This calmed me despite the struggle. It was a simple routine, a restoration of peace to my day, and likely a restoration to the cow's peace too. The next hours passed in a blur until I came back to one sound mind at noon. In that time, I knew I had called for a vet for Charlie and was waiting for her to get here. I had thrown sawdust and flour on the black blood and hauled it out to the edge of the pasture to let it burn off. I took notes of the damages, showered, put the 742 back in its rack after cleaning it off. I sat in my recliner, staring at the TV I hadn't even cut on, lost in my memories that played last night on loop. I suddenly felt exhausted, utterly drained of any semblance of energy, and I was out cold in mere seconds. I woke up hours later to the sound of knocking at my door. It was Kathy, the town veterinarian. Walking to greet her was awkward and stiff. A slight headache thumped my skull each step. Trying to put on a normal face, I eased the door open, and immediately I could tell I looked way worse than I thought by her widened eyes. "Holy hell, Jake, are you okay?" Fumbling for a cigarette out of my jacket pocket, I stuttered badly to get a sentence started, tried looking all around to find something that would get the screw turning. The barn. Charlie and me had a rough night. Really rough. And he needs some looking at, Kathy. Mind going with me to the barn? She cocked her eyes slightly in confusion. Her blue eyes looked over me and through me. A kick-up gust of chilly wind blew her blonde locks across her face, but did little to hide the concerned look. Jake, you look sunburned purely in the face mid-fall. You're stuttering like a broken record, and there's blood all over you. Is that from Charlie? This isn't the Jake McClooney I went to Lancaster High with. In the months to come, folks remarked about a difference in me, how Jake McClooney didn't smile quite as warmly, or how intent I focused on the forest and skies towards nighttime. Of course, I had no damn good way of explaining it to the folks that lived in Pritchard County, but I'm hoping here I get some sympathy, or maybe some help. In any regard, the bat was not the first of its kind, nor is it the last monster I would run into and have to deal with.